As you probably know, I generally don't talk about celebrities on this channel. I dipped my toes into that nightmarish mess last year with Sam Smith's decline from British pretty boy to swelled up homunculus, and the year before with Demi Lovato deciding to come out as non-binary as an attempt to revive her floundering career. She walked it back, by the way. That was always just her trying to grasp for relevance. Hollywood is cancerous. I genuinely hate it, and I haven't paid attention to the latest actors or musicians or whatever in decades now. Even back in high school when my peers were all over celebrity gossip, I just didn't care. I was too busy playing video games. And it's just as well because Hollywood seems to be on its last legs. Coronavirus was the death knell for theaters, and they still really haven't seen a revival. Nobody cares about watching new movies or TV shows anymore. Mainstream music is all garbage. The celebrities themselves are all preachy pieces of shit. Like, remember when they all came out to sing John Lennon's Imagine? It's come to the point that whenever I see a TikTok collage of celebs talking to the camera, I legitimately want to just do the opposite of whatever they're saying. The first time I'd ever even heard of Lizzo as an unplugged anti-normie was this article back during the George Floyd protests, where Lizzo along with other celebs joined the chorus of people calling for defunding the police. Remember in the last video when I made the claim that the upper class calls for progressive policies that they won't have to bear the burden of because it makes them seem more morally righteous to their peers? Yeah, this is pretty much what I'm talking about. It's not the gated communities in Hollywood that Lizzo and the other celebs live in that experience anarchy when the police pull back from an Antifa riot, and they have more than enough wealth to afford private security when necessary. They will never feel the negative effects of defunding the police, which is why they can call for it so openly. But what I really remember Lizzo for, and probably the same with you guys, was the whole crystal flute thing from back in 2022. Does that ring a bell? Here's the story. During the War of 1812, when the British burned down the White House, Dolly Madison, the wife of President James Madison, managed to save some historical artifacts during her escape. The most famous one was a portrait of George Washington, but among the artifacts was James Madison's crystal flute. Claude Laurent, or is it Lorrain? A French watchmaker and mechanic, invented the process to create glass flutes in 1806. This was an important innovation as temperature change altered the sound of the commonly available wood and ivory flutes at the time. Many of his flutes are glass flutes, but he did use the same process to make significantly rarer and more ornate crystal flutes. He gifted one of the crystal flutes to President Madison to commemorate his second presidential inauguration. The flute passed from the Madisons to Dolly's son from her first marriage, a man named John Payne Todd. Todd was known as a gambler and a drinker, and upon his death, the flute passed to his doctor, Cornelius Boyle. It's not confirmed, but it's pretty obvious that Todd made this decision to cover his medical debts. The flute stayed in Dr. Boyle's family until it was shown off at the United States National Museum in 1903. The Boyle family sold it to Dayton C. Miller, a flute collector and physicist, who gifted his entire collection of 1,700 flutes to the Library of Congress in 1941. We don't know if the flute had ever actually been played during all the times it changed hands. I'm sure somebody picked it up and blew into it once or twice in private, but since 1941, the flute is confirmed to never have been played until Lizzo picked it up in 2022. Lizzo is not just a pop singer, but also an accomplished flutist, and when she visited the Library of Congress, she requested to play Madison's flute. After negotiating with the library staff and Capitol Police, they allowed her to handle the flute under their watch. Her performance with the flute was actually pretty good. No real complaints here, at least until she twerked with it. It was at this point that the story became part of the culture war news cycle back in 2022. Conservatives were in an uproar about the defiling of a priceless American artifact, while progressives were declaring it a triumph of how far black women had come. After the event, Lizzo asked the library if she could borrow the flute for her Washington concert. They agreed, though they sent the flute to and from the venue under constant guard by Capitol Police. And this is when the infamous viral clip took place of Lizzo twerking with the flute, dressed up in her gaudy stage attire.
It's crystal. It's like playing out of a wine glass, bitch. So be patient. Bitch, I just twerked and played cool. History is freaking cool, you guys.
Yes, this means this is actually the second time Lizzo twerked with the flute. The first impromptu at the Library of Congress, the second on stage. Now personally, I don't give a shit about the crystal flute. And honestly, I am hard-pressed to believe that your average American conservative gave a shit about it before this event even took place. There are certain American artifacts that patriots hold dear. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the first American flag, the Liberty Bell, Mount Rushmore and the Statue of Liberty, if we expand to things large enough to also be locations. These are all artifacts known the world over as being quintessentially American. But James Madison's flute? I've never even heard an American mention it before Lizzo twerked with it. Nonetheless, conservatives declared this to be a grave insult to America when this story went viral, that it was a defilement of a priceless artifact of Americana by an avatar of modernism dragging a sanctified symbol down to the level of the mundane. A common view of modernism by conservatives is that both the rejection of spirituality and the drive to make everything equal leads to the desire to deliberately profane anything considered sacred, that the high must be brought low. And there's at least some truth to this. While we don't know if Lizzo was actually the first person to play Madison's crystal flute, she probably wasn't in fact, when she stated on stage that nobody's ever played it before and that she was going to do it, that's the modernist impulse she's referring to, at least on a subconscious level. And that makes sense, think about it. If I gave you a historical flute, and I told you it had never been played by anybody before, once it's in your hands, you'd probably feel an urge to play it. That intrinsic human impulse to be a little chaotic, break a rule, mess with things a bit, along with the possibility of doing something that nobody's ever done before, that's all very understandable. Meanwhile, the people who care about such things would probably feel very strongly that the continuity of nobody's ever played this flute before should be preserved. It's very easy to put yourself in the shoes of either person and see why they want what they want. And here's the thing, the response to this conservative outcry by people on the extreme left kinda shows my analysis of this to be correct. For example, look at Jezebel's article, conservatives very offended by Lizzo twerking with slave owner's crystal flute. Lizzo played the antique instrument on stage for a brief solo, being the first person to ever do so, liberating it from its vault at the Library of Congress, where it's been stored for the better part of 2 centuries. Let's just take a moment to remind ourselves that Madison owned more than 100 slaves and originated the 3/5 compromise that refused to recognize black Americans as whole people. Lizzo does not owe him the respect of wearing pants to play his instrument 2 centuries later. Okay, fair enough. But this passage makes it sound like Matt Walsh was correct when he said that Lizzo's performance was a form of racial retribution, or that Ben Shapiro was correct when he called it a vulgarization of American history, both of whom are people that Jezebel mocked for caring about this in this very article. This is literally the "don't be silly" exclamation, while the very thing being described is actually happening. This modernist impulse of bringing the high low has been termed as Lizzofication by conservatives. An article on Revolver titled "The Lizzofication of America" touches on the surface of the idea. The left is focused on pushing fat acceptance and beauty at any size, which despite some good intentions gives many people who are struggling with food issues and obesity an excuse to stay in their dangerously unhealthy lifestyle. Think of it as the Lizzofication of America. Music artist Lizzo has put her obesity front and center and made her weight the cornerstone of her brand. The idea that's being appealed to here is worshipping vice, specifically when it comes to physical health. Rare thyroid issues notwithstanding, when somebody works out and does cardio and eats right, they're not the shape of Lizzo. They may have been blessed with genetics, but that only gets you so far, and you can see the result of their virtuous habits in the shape of their body. But Lizzofication here refers to not valuing the person who keeps himself in good shape and viewing their positive, healthy habits as virtuous, but instead valuing letting yourself go, indulging in vice, becoming a pleasure-seeking animal, putting self-acceptance over self-improvement. That's what the phrase Lizzofication refers to in conservative circles. The weight part of the conversation is only one part. In a more general sense, Lizzofication refers to the abolishment of moral standards and a decline into perpetual vice. The internet has had conceptions of this idea from before Lizzo and the crystal flute, of course. One meme specifically comes to mind, where the guy is strapped into the Coom machine and spends all day high and orgasming. Another guy shows up and says, "This is kinda weird," and then he's critiqued with, "OMG, let people enjoy things." This is getting at the same sentiment. We all understand what too little freedom looks like. It's an oppressive state, a calcified social structure. Everyone's behaviors are rigidly controlled by top-down power. That is the 1984 world. Lizzofication is the newest term in a long line of terms used to refer to what too much freedom looks like. A complete and total lack of moral standards. All limits and regulation abolished. Everyone simply indulging in whatever base pleasure strikes their fancy without any thoughts of the future. This is the Brave New World, and right-wingers of all stripes have been warning about it for a long time now. From the literal author of Brave New World, Huxley, who was a lukewarm conservative himself, to Julius Evola, the aristocratic post-fascist writer who warned about the Kali Yuga, the dark age of unleashed materialistic appetites, to Christopher Latch, the American historian and classical conservative, who wrote at length about how consumerist capitalism eroded traditional American institutions like the family or the church. This is why people on the right tend to reject ideas like self-esteem or self-love, not because they necessarily hate the idea of loving yourself, but because excessively focusing on that kind of purely inward thinking leads to the dissolution of standards. You've all heard this before. You don't need to change even though you're 600 pounds. Love yourself, girl. If the world doesn't accept you for who you are, that's their problem, not yours. There is a time and place for that kind of rhetoric. Sometimes you really are correct and the world really is wrong. But do you think that's the case when you're the fucking blob? That is what conservatives mean when they say the phrase Lizzofication. It means they reject the post-Reagan free market neoconservatism that dominated the right wing from the 80s onward, as the economics of that system was led by a specific type of classical liberal morality that posited freedom as the ultimate good, that any barriers or limits placed on people were restrictions that needed to be abolished in order for freedom to be achieved, even though in reality at least some of those barriers or limits are both restrictive and good. Lizzo is being used to refer to this concept because she's currently a big celebrity, and weight gain is just an intuitively easy example of what's being described here. If you're limited by a rule that states don't eat so much and work out every day, that is a restriction on your behavior. There are some things you can't do and other things that you must do. Abolishing that limit does make you more free, but it also makes you a worse person. Therefore, some types of freedom must be bad for you, and some types of restriction must be good for you. For a conservative, this logic applies not only to weight and health, but to all domains of human activity, like monogamy in romantic relationships. That is a restriction on who you can sleep with. Or the duty to help your family and friends in times of need. That is a restriction on your time and your energy. These are restrictions, but they're still good. That is what conservatives mean when they talk about Lizzofication. The idea that all limits and restrictions should be abolished for ideological reasons, even if it actually makes people's practical lives worse off for it. As is the case with most of my videos discussing ideas using a current event as a starting off point, Lizzo herself actually plays second fiddle to the concept of Lizzofication. She's the avatar of a more universal concept. That's not to say she doesn't embody what the conservatives are talking about, though. She obviously does. For example, when Lizzo did a Lord of the Rings spot, and Lizzo fans began demanding she make an appearance in Rings of Power Season 2, as if that show couldn't get any worse, Lord of the Rings fans reacted with disgust. Okay, Lizzo lass is pretty funny, but seriously, it was mostly disgust. The disgust wasn't solely aimed at Lizzo, though she got her fair share of it. It was also aimed at the general concept of the Lizzofication of Lord of the Rings, the idea of profaning what the fans hold as sacred. Not because Lizzo's in it, but because the loosening of moral standards required to make Lizzo being in it be considered acceptable. This clip of Lizzo came across my feed recently, and regular viewer JMax said about it, "I might get hate for this, but this makes me as upset as when super thin models and celebrities were pushed into our cultural zeitgeist for girls to aspire to. The amount of childhood obesity I see in my day-to-day is heartbreaking." What's being described here is basically that super thin women in media gave little girls anorexia in the 90s and 2000s. That's a pretty well documented effect at this point. However, in an effort to tackle that mental health crisis, we've now overcorrected, and now we're starting to see the opposite negative effect. Fat women on TV, fat girls in real life. Neither of these things is good. We should be promoting health, not the people who throw up their lunch, or the people who ate the thrown up lunch. I did a whole video on fat activism already, but I'm not sure if I ever covered the moral arguments that underpin it. There's certainly this attitude that only women have the license to be obese, while men still need to shape up, at least in the media, which we can partially lay the blame on feminist activism and no real male equivalent existing for that. We're seeing the same thing happen with Lizzo that we saw with Tess Holliday, or Adele, or Lena Dunham, the pushing of these figures in all of their obese glory as if they were something to aspire to. In fact, when we saw the backlash to Adele losing weight, in retrospect, that now seems to be people getting angry that Adele wasn't simply sticking to the lowest common denominator, that she was actually bettering herself, because getting better means inequality. It means rising up in a hierarchy of value. It means virtuous behaviors and habits. It means rejecting the lowest common denominator that is essential to Lizzofication. But Dev, why are you talking about this now? The crystal flute thing isn't a recent event. Well, Lizzo got slapped with a lawsuit by her backup dancers a week or two ago, claiming that she made them eat bananas out of sex workers' vaginas. The court documents claim that during a night in Amsterdam's red light district, Lizzo's employees felt pressured by Lizzo to take turns touching the nude performers, catching dildos launched from the performers' vaginas, and eating bananas protruding from the performers' vaginas, and that Lizzo again deceived them into a similar show 1 month later. One of the workers, Ariana Davis, also made the claim that she had no choice but to soil herself on stage during an audition, fearing the repercussions of excusing herself to go to the bathroom. Lizzo fired her on the spot after learning that she was recording her meetings, despite her being contractually entitled to a copy of the notes of those meetings. The charges brought against Lizzo and her production company include sexual, religious, and racial harassment, disability discrimination, assault, and false imprisonment. It's possible that Lizzo's innocent, and that these are just disgruntled employees blowing up old stories from 2019 in order to get some money. We've seen a lot of that kind of thing recently, where people might have an edge case of a claim, but it's also plausible they were totally okay with it, and now they're acting like they're not in retrospect in order to cancel somebody. That's pretty common right now. But despite being a progressive cultural darling, Lizzo is now being canceled because believing victims has become the new push. I know Brianna Wu mentioned to me on Twitter that the feminist position is believe women, as in take sexual assault claims seriously, not believe all women, as in consider all sexual assault claims to be fact regardless of proof. And you know what? Fair enough. I can actually get behind the first statement. But there is no doubt in my mind that in the current progressive cultural zeitgeist, we have absolutely shifted towards the second statement, and Lizzo's cancellation is simply another instance of it happening. It is reasonable to wonder if these are simply disgruntled employees getting back at their rich boss a few years later, where nobody knows what actually happened anymore. But the people canceling Lizzo don't care about that kind of nuance. They just believe the victims. The only thing I have to say about that story is, I am not surprised that a woman who represents the philosophy of having low standards as a moral good might actually end up having low standards herself. Lizzo is not a good role model for anyone, even less so than the celebrities who have actually said they're not role models, like Charles Barkley, for example. It's one thing to be in the public eye. It's another thing to be held up as a standard. And Lizzo, just like Tess Holliday or Lena Dunham or Adele, is not a standard to judge anybody by. Though, I guess that's the ultimate point. Lizzofication is the final abolishing of the concept of standards.